Imagine lying on a straw mattress in a drafty, dimly lit cottage, wrapped in layers of wool, listening to the wind howling outside. Medieval peasants faced harsh winters without the comforts of central heating, electricity, or modern insulation. Yet, they survived, using ingenious methods passed down through generations. In this video, we'll explore how medieval peasants braved the coldest nights, finding warmth and comfort despite their challenging circumstances. Imagine a small, humble dwelling made of wattle and daub, nestled in a rural medieval village. The cottage is simple, a single room, or perhaps two if the family is fortunate. Its thatched roof sagging slightly under the weight of accumulated snow. The walls, made of a timber frame filled with woven sticks and covered in a mixture of mud, straw, and manure, are surprisingly sturdy, but far from impervious to the icy winds of winter. Inside, the cottage is dimly lit, even during the day. Small, glassless windows are covered with oiled cloth or animal skins to keep the cold out, though they do little to block the drafts that snake through the cracks. In the corner, a fire burns low, its orange glow barely reaching the farthest corners of the room. The hearth is the heart of the home, both literally and figuratively, as it provides the only consistent source of heat. The layout of a typical peasant cottage is pragmatic, designed to make the most of limited resources. The hearth occupies the central space, often surrounded by a ring of rough-hewn stones. Above it, a simple iron pot hangs from a hook or tripod, simmering a thin stew. The smoke rises, winding its way toward a small hole in the roof, or escaping through the loosely thatched eaves. In cottages with no chimney, the smoke simply gathers inside, lingering like a spectral presence before seeping out through any available gap. Around the fire, the family gathers, huddled together for warmth. The floor is hard-packed earth, occasionally covered with a scattering of rushes or straw, which not only adds a bit of insulation, but also helps absorb the moisture tracked in from outside. Sometimes, fresh herbs are mixed in with the rushes to mask the earthy smell and, hopefully, deter pests. The beds are rudimentary, simple wooden frames, or even just piles of straw on the ground. Thin woolen blankets, often patched and worn, offer scant protection against the night chill. Some families may have feather-stuffed mattresses, but these are rare luxuries. More commonly, they pile straw high, cover it with a rough linen sheet, and hope that the collective body heat will be enough to stave off the cold. Privacy is a concept foreign to most peasants. The entire family, including parents, children, and sometimes extended relatives, sleeps together in one space. This communal sleeping arrangement is not just a matter of space, but a practical way to retain warmth. During particularly harsh winters, even livestock might be brought inside, their body heat contributing to the overall temperature of the room. A few chickens cluck softly in the corner, nestled in a makeshift pen, while a goat or pig, if owned, might lie tethered near the entrance. The architecture itself is designed with survival in mind. The low ceilings help trap heat, while the thick walls, though drafty in places, offer a measure of insulation. Roofs are sloped to shed snow, preventing collapse, and the thatch, despite being porous, provides a degree of protection against wind and rain. Peasants learn early on to make minor repairs themselves, plugging holes with clay or extra straw whenever necessary. The cottage's layout and construction reflect centuries of adaptation to a harsh environment. These homes are built with locally available materials, shaped by the needs of those who live in them. The walls may lack the precision of stone masonry, and the floors may be perpetually cold, but these dwellings are functional, offering refuge from the bitter cold of winter. Yet, despite their best efforts, warmth is never guaranteed. On the coldest nights, when the wind howls like a banshee through the village, peasants must rely on every available tactic to survive. They may pile more rushes onto the floor, hang additional animal skins over the windows, and feed the fire with precious bits of wood. Sometimes they sit up late into the night, feeding the flames and telling stories, if only to distract themselves from the gnawing cold. Ultimately, these cottages are more than just shelters. They are symbols of resilience and resourcefulness. In their simplicity, they embody the spirit of medieval life, a constant negotiation between human ingenuity and the unforgiving elements. Clothing was not merely a means of modesty or decoration for medieval peasants. It was a vital tool for survival, especially during the coldest months of the year. Without access to modern synthetic fabrics or advanced thermal wear, they had to rely on natural materials, layered strategically to conserve as much body heat as possible. Wool was the cornerstone of medieval clothing. It was readily available, relatively affordable, and most importantly, excellent at trapping heat. Unlike other fabrics, wool retained warmth even when damp, a crucial quality in a time when peasants often worked in wet, muddy, or snowy conditions. The process of creating woolen garments began with shearing the sheep, a labor-intensive task that was typically done in the spring. The wool was then washed, carded, spun into yarn, and woven into fabric. Those who could not afford new cloth would patch up old garments, creating multi-layered quilt-like clothing that provided additional insulation. The first layer of a peasant's winter attire was a simple linen tunic or chemise. Linen was relatively breathable, which helped to wick away sweat and prevent it from freezing against the skin. The chemise was typically long, extending to the knees or even the ankles, and was worn day and night. Over this base layer, they would add a thicker woolen tunic, known as a cotardie, which provided the primary source of warmth. For additional insulation, peasants often layered more than one tunic, especially during severe cold spells. The outermost tunic might be lined with fur if they could afford it, or stuffed with straw or dried grasses to create a rudimentary padding. The more layers a person wore, the more air pockets were created, and these pockets effectively trapped warm air close to the body, functioning like a primitive version of modern thermal wear. Hoods and cowls were indispensable during the winter months. Made from thick wool, they covered the head, neck, and shoulders, preventing heat from escaping from these vulnerable areas. The hoods often extended down over the chest, creating a layered effect that helped to block out the wind. Some hoods were lined with fur or leather for added warmth. Footwear was a particular challenge. Most peasant shoes were made of simple leather, often with wooden soles. Leather, while durable, did little to insulate against the cold ground. To combat this, peasants would stuff their shoes with straw or dry grasses, creating a barrier between their feet and the frozen earth. In some cases, they would wrap their feet in strips of cloth before putting on their shoes, effectively creating an extra insulating layer. Socks, when available, were also made of wool and were worn over multiple layers of cloth wrappings. Gloves or mittens were less common, as they required more fabric than most peasants could spare. Instead, they might wrap their hands in scraps of cloth or animal skins, securing them with twine or strips of leather. Wealthier peasants, or those with access to fur-bearing animals, might craft mittens from rabbit, squirrel, or even fox pelts, though such items were considered valuable and often passed down through generations. Despite the layers, the clothing was far from perfect. Wool was heavy, prone to absorbing moisture and slow to dry. Linen, though breathable, could become stiff and uncomfortable when damp. Maintaining warmth was a constant battle, especially for those whose clothes were worn thin from years of use. For the poorest peasants, layering was not always an option. Some had only a single tunic to wear, which they would keep on day and night, rarely washing it for fear of it disintegrating. Others might beg or trade for old, discarded garments, piecing together scraps to form patchwork cloaks or tunics. These makeshift garments were heavy and cumbersome, but they offered some degree of protection against the elements. Children, too, faced unique challenges. Growing rapidly, they often outgrew their clothes before new ones could be made or acquired. As a result, they would wear hand-me-downs several sizes too big, with sleeves and hems rolled up or tied with bits of cord. Infants and young children were swaddled tightly in woolen wraps, their heads covered with hoods or caps to prevent heat loss. At night, peasants rarely undressed to sleep. Instead, they would crawl under layers of blankets, cloaks, and animal skins, often still wearing their day clothes. Removing layers was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. For the average peasant, every scrap of fabric was essential. Layering was not only a practical necessity, but also a cultural practice, a daily ritual of survival against the biting cold. Each layer represented the ingenuity and resourcefulness of a people who had little but managed to make the most of what they had. And when the wind howled through the village and frost crept under the cottage door, those layers became more than just clothing. They became armor against the relentless chill of winter. The hearth was the beating heart of the medieval peasant's cottage, a source of warmth, light, and sustenance. Positioned centrally within the single-room dwelling, it was more than just a place to cook food. It was a lifeline during the harshest winters. Without it, survival would have been nearly impossible. Constructed from stones, clay, or packed earth, the hearth was a simple yet essential structure. Unlike modern fireplaces with chimneys, many peasant hearths had no direct outlet for smoke. Instead, the smoke was left to drift through the room, eventually escaping through the thatched roof or small openings in the walls. This filled the cottage with a lingering haze, stinging the eyes and coating every surface with a thin layer of soot. Yet, despite the discomfort, the hearth remained the primary and often only source of warmth. Starting a fire was not as simple as striking a match. Medieval peasants had to rely on more labor-intensive methods. Flint and steel were the most common tools, with the steel being struck against the flint to create sparks. These sparks would be directed onto a small pile of tinder, dry moss, straw, or scraps of linen, which would catch and slowly smolder. Once the tinder caught flame, it was carefully fed with thin twigs or dried grasses until the fire grew strong enough to sustain larger logs. But firewood was a precious commodity, especially in regions where forests were owned by lords or the church. Unauthorized gathering of wood could result in severe punishment, so peasants had to be resourceful. They collected fallen branches, twigs, and even dried animal dung to use as fuel. Dung, though pungent, burned steadily and was readily available. In some areas, peat was also harvested and dried for use in the hearth, its slow-burning properties making it ideal for maintaining a consistent heat. Managing the fire was a delicate art. Peasants learned to bank the coals at night, covering them with ashes to keep them smouldering until morning. This not only conserved fuel, but also made it easier to rekindle the fire without starting from scratch. If the fire went out, they might have to borrow embers from a neighbor, a common practice that fostered a sense of community in the village. The hearth also doubled as a rudimentary kitchen. A simple iron pot would hang from a hook or tripod over the fire, simmering a thin pottage made from vegetables, grains, and the occasional scrap of meat. The constant bubbling pot not only provided sustenance, but also contributed to the overall warmth of the room. Cooking was a slow, smoky process, and the scent of charred wood and boiling stew became an inseparable part of daily life. Seating arrangements around the hearth were minimal. Perhaps a wooden bench or a few crude stools, each one positioned as close to the fire as possible. In larger families, people would sit shoulder to shoulder, huddling together for warmth. Elderly family members and young children were given priority seating closest to the fire, as they were most vulnerable to the cold. In the dead of winter, when the nights stretched on interminably, the hearth became the center of social life. Families would gather around it, telling stories, singing songs, or simply staring into the flickering flames, lulled into a trance by the dance of light and shadow. The glow of the fire provided the only illumination in an otherwise pitch-black room, casting eerie, elongated shadows against the walls. But even with the hearth ablaze, the room was far from toasty. Heat distribution was uneven, with those closest to the fire feeling its warmth, while those farther away shivered in the chill. Drafts crept in through cracks in the walls, and the cold ground sucked away body heat. Peasants would often place heated stones or clay bricks in the fire, then wrap them in cloth and tuck them into their bedding to serve as primitive bed warmers. The hearth also had its dangers. Without proper ventilation, smoke could accumulate, leading to respiratory problems and irritated eyes. Sparks from the fire posed a risk of igniting the straw-covered floor or thatched roof, and children or animals wandering too close to the flames could be burned. Maintaining a fire demanded constant vigilance, a responsibility that often fell to the older children or those too frail to work in the fields. Despite these hazards, the hearth remained the heart of the home. It was a place of warmth in a cold world, a gathering spot where families came together, seeking comfort in the company of others and the steady crackle of burning wood. And as the fire crackled and the night wore on, the cottage filled with the mingling scents of smoke, cooking stew, and damp wool, a sensory reminder of the enduring struggle to survive the coldest of winters. In a world without electric blankets, central heating, or even glass windows, keeping warm at night was a constant battle for medieval peasants. The cold crept in from every corner, seeping through the walls, the floor, and even the roof. Nighttime was when the chill became most intense, and peasants had to rely on every trick they knew to stay warm until morning. Beds in a peasant cottage were far from the plush, feather-stuffed mattresses of the wealthy. Instead, they consisted of simple wooden frames, or, more often, little more than piles of straw or rushes heaped directly onto the earthen floor. Over time, the straw became compacted, creating a dense, uncomfortable mat that did little to cushion or insulate against the cold ground. When resources allowed, peasants might cover the straw with a coarse linen sheet, but even that was a luxury. Blankets were another matter. Wool was the preferred material, not because it was particularly soft or comfortable, but because it retained heat even when damp. Peasants would layer themselves with as many blankets as they could acquire, each one patched and mended over the years. Some blankets were so old and worn that they had to be stitched together from multiple fragments, creating a quilt-like effect. These heavy, scratchy coverings were essential for keeping out the cold, but they also trapped smoke and dust, making them perpetually musty. For those who couldn't afford sufficient blankets, animal skins became a valuable resource. Deer, rabbit, or even sheepskins were draped over bedding for added insulation. These furs were heavy, oily, and often carried the lingering scent of the animal, but they were invaluable on particularly frigid nights. A single wolf or bear pelt, if acquired through trade or luck, could become the prized possession of an entire family, passed down through generations as a cherished winter survival tool. Bed placement also played a crucial role in staying warm. Beds were positioned as close to the hearth as possible, though this came with its own risks. Sparks or embers from the fire could easily ignite straw bedding, so families had to balance proximity to the heat source with safety concerns. In some cottages, a makeshift partition made of cloth or animal skins might be hung to block drafts, effectively creating a tiny, insulated sleeping nook around the bed. But the real warmth came not from the bedding itself, but from the bodies lying beneath it. Family members slept together, packed tightly to conserve body heat. Parents and children, siblings, and even extended family members would huddle under the same blankets, forming a single, collective mass of warmth. This communal sleeping arrangement was not only practical, but also fostered closeness and reinforced familial bonds. Children, particularly infants, were especially vulnerable to the cold. Babies were often swaddled in multiple layers of linen and wool, with only their faces exposed to the air. Some parents would keep their infants tucked against their own bodies throughout the night, using their own warmth to shield the child from the bitter chill. Footwear was seldom removed at night. Shoes, wrapped in rags or stuffed with straw, stayed on, and extra pairs of woolen socks, if available, were layered over them. Feet were the first parts of the body to lose heat, so keeping them warm was a priority. Some families heated stones or clay bricks in the hearth, wrapping them in cloth and placing them at the foot of the bed as makeshift bed warmers. These stones radiated heat for hours, slowly cooling as the night wore on. Sleeping positions were strategic. People curled up in fetal positions to conserve heat, tucking their knees to their chests and pulling blankets tight over their heads. Heads were often covered with hoods, caps, or extra cloth to prevent heat loss. Even the simple act of breathing into the fabric of a blanket helped to create a small pocket of warm air around the face, reducing exposure to the icy air inside the cottage. Despite all these efforts, the cold still seeped in. On the most brutally cold nights, the interior temperature of a peasant cottage might not be much higher than the temperature outside. Frost formed along the walls, and the breath of the sleeping family members rose as visible clouds in the dark. If a fire had been banked properly, the coals would still be smouldering come morning, allowing the family to quickly rekindle the flames without starting from scratch. But if the fire had gone out, the morning routine began, with shivering hands striking flint against steel, struggling to coax a new spark to life. The family would emerge from their tightly packed bedding, each person reluctant to leave the small pocket of warmth they had created. Blankets were draped around shoulders like cloaks, and hands were rubbed together to restore circulation. And so, the nightly battle against the cold continued. Each night, a test of endurance and resourcefulness. For medieval peasants, warmth was not a given, but a hard-won victory. A constant, never-ending struggle against the relentless chill of winter. For medieval peasants, food was not just a matter of sustenance. It was a matter of survival, especially during the coldest months of winter. When the ground was frozen solid and the fields lay barren, the ability to keep the family fed depended entirely on the preparations made during the previous seasons. Preservation techniques were not just practical, but absolutely vital. Without the luxury of refrigeration, or even root cellars in many cases, peasants had to be inventive in finding ways to make their meager harvest last until spring. One of the most common methods of preservation was drying. Vegetables such as peas, beans, and lentils were harvested in the late summer and spread out to dry under the sun. Once dried, they were stored in clay pots, sacks, or wooden bins, where they could last for months without spoiling. Grains like barley, oats, and rye were similarly dried and stored. Flour made from these grains became the staple of winter meals. Bread was baked in communal ovens when firewood was available, but the loaves were dense and hard, sometimes so tough that they had to be soaked in broth or ale just to be chewable. In fact, The term hardtack referred to these nearly inedible but long-lasting loaves of bread. Salting was another crucial method for preserving food. Meat was particularly vulnerable to spoilage, and since livestock was often slaughtered in the late autumn to reduce the number of animals that needed to be fed over the winter, salting became a primary way to keep meat edible for months. Pork, being fattier and more abundant, was the most common meat to be salted, though any animal that could be hunted or trapped, rabbits, deer, birds, was also preserved in this way. Salt was a precious commodity, expensive and not always readily available to the poorest peasants. Some families used brine, a saltwater solution, to soak meat before hanging it to dry in the rafters. This created a rudimentary form of jerky, tough and chewy, but rich in protein. Fish, particularly herring and cod, were also heavily salted and dried, often traded by coastal villages to inland communities as one of the few available sources of protein during winter. Smoking was another common preservation method. A small smokehouse or even a simple structure built near the hearth could be used to smoke meat and fish. The constant smouldering of green wood infused the food with a smoky flavor while drawing out moisture, making it less prone to rot. Smoked meats could be kept for weeks or even months if properly cured. Foraging and gathering were essential survival skills. In the weeks leading up to winter, peasants would scour the woods for anything edible. Nuts, acorns, and berries were collected and stored. Acorns were particularly abundant, but they required careful processing to remove their bitter tannins. First, they were shelled and ground into flour, then leached in water to remove the tannins before being dried and stored. The resulting flour was mixed with other grains to stretch out bread supplies. Herbs and medicinal plants were also dried and hung in bundles from the ceiling beams. Not only did they add flavor to otherwise bland stews and porridges, but they also provided a semblance of nutrition and, in some cases, basic medicine. Sage, thyme, rosemary, and mint were common, as were wild garlic and nettles. Fermentation was another ingenious method of preserving food. Cabbage, turnips, and other root vegetables were packed in barrels and covered in brine to create rudimentary pickles or sauerkraut. The fermentation process not only extended the shelf life of these vegetables, but also provided vital nutrients that helped stave off scurvy and other vitamin deficiencies during the long winter months. In some regions, peasants took advantage of natural refrigeration by storing food in pits dug into the ground. These storage pits were lined with straw or leaves and covered with boards or heavy stones to keep out vermin. Root vegetables, potatoes, and other hardy produce were buried in these pits, where the cool earth acted as a primitive refrigerator, slowing down the rotting process. Beverages were also part of the preservation strategy. Ale was brewed from grains, providing a safe, calorie-rich drink that could last for weeks. Fermented drinks like cider and mead were also common, as the alcohol content helped prevent spoilage. Water, often contaminated, was less reliable, so ale and weak beer became the standard drinks for peasants, even for children. Despite all these efforts, food was scarce. Meals were repetitive and monotonous, consisting mostly of gruel, pottage, and coarse bread. Pottage was a catch-all term for any kind of thick stew or porridge made by boiling grains, beans, and whatever vegetables or scraps of meat were available. The pot was kept simmering over the hearth, and new ingredients were added whenever possible, creating a perpetually evolving meal that never quite tasted the same. On particularly cold nights, the pottage might be thickened with barley or oats to make it more filling, while bones were boiled repeatedly to extract every last bit of marrow and flavor. The resulting broth, though thin, was a valuable source of warmth and sustenance. Despite the lack of variety, the act of sharing a meal brought a sense of togetherness and comfort. Families gathered around the hearth, bowls in hand, slurping pottage and chewing on chunks of hard bread while discussing the events of the day. Mealtime was a brief respite from the cold and a reminder that, for all the hardships they faced, they still had each other, and for the moment, they still had enough to eat. In the medieval world, sleep was not the continuous, uninterrupted slumber that we think of today. Instead, sleep was segmented, often broken into two distinct periods, what historians refer to as first sleep and second sleep. This pattern was a natural response to the long, dark nights and the challenges of staying warm in a drafty, poorly insulated cottage. After the evening meal, once the fire had been banked and the hearth began to cool, the family would settle down for the night. They would gather close together, huddling under shared blankets or animal skins, each person pressing against the next for warmth. The ambient temperature inside the cottage would gradually drop, the air growing colder and colder as the night deepened. The first sleep typically lasted for 3 to 4 hours. During this time, the family would enter a state of deep sleep, their bodies releasing the accumulated fatigue of a long day's labor. But around midnight or a little after, many would wake up naturally, shivering in the dark. This was not considered unusual or even inconvenient. It was simply part of the nightly routine. Upon waking, peasants might stoke the fire, adding another piece of wood or a clump of dried dung to the embers to revive the warmth. The flames would flicker to life, casting dancing shadows against the walls and providing a brief but welcome reprieve from the biting cold. During this time, people might also relieve themselves, check on livestock housed in the cottage, or adjust the bedding to ensure everyone was adequately covered. But the waking period was not just about tending to the fire or performing small chores. It was also a time for quiet reflection, prayer, and even conversation. In the dim light of the hearth, family members might murmur to one another, sharing dreams, recounting worries, or simply passing the time. This period between sleeps was often seen as a liminal space, a time when the boundaries between the waking world and the dream world were blurred. It was also a time when people might engage in light tasks that required minimal effort but kept them occupied, mending a garment, weaving, or simply sitting by the fire and staring into the embers. For those more spiritually inclined, this waking period became a time for prayer or contemplation. Some believed that the veil between the physical world and the spirit world was thinnest during these early hours, making it an opportune moment to commune with ancestors, say prayers for the dead, or seek guidance through meditation. In fact, many medieval prayer books contain specific prayers and devotions meant to be recited during this middle-of-the-night vigil. After an hour or two, the second sleep would begin. This second stretch of sleep was often lighter, more restless. The fire would be reduced to a mere glow of embers, the room growing colder and darker as the night wore on. By this point, the accumulated warmth of the hearth had dissipated, and the temperature inside the cottage would have dropped significantly. To conserve as much body heat as possible, peasants huddled even closer together, pressing their bodies against one another, each person serving as a living source of warmth. Infants and young children were sandwiched between adults, their tiny bodies vulnerable to the cold and requiring the protection of adult warmth. The elderly, too, were given a prime position in the center of the group, as their frail bodies were less capable of generating and retaining heat. Despite the discomfort, this second sleep was often filled with vivid dreams. The combination of fragmented sleep, the cold air, and the residual warmth of the fire created a dream state that was often more intense, more surreal. Some peasants believed that the dreams experienced during second sleep were prophetic or held deeper meaning, messages from the spirit world, or omens of things to come. Eventually, as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the tiny, soot-streaked window, the family would stir. The second sleep would end, and the day would begin. The embers would be coaxed back to life, water would be heated for a thin gruel or porridge, and the cycle of labor and survival would resume. For medieval peasants, sleep was not a luxury, but a necessity, a brief respite from the grueling demands of daily life. Yet, even in sleep, they could never fully escape the cold. The winter chill seeped into every crevice of the cottage, its icy fingers reaching under blankets and through straw mattresses, a constant, inescapable reminder of the fragility of life. The medieval peasants' daily battle against the cold extended beyond their immediate surroundings and into their very clothing. In a time when fabrics were expensive, labor-intensive to produce, and difficult to maintain, clothing was more than just a matter of fashion. It was a vital line of defense against the bone-chilling cold. For peasants, clothing was typically homemade, hand-sewn, and constructed from rough, heavy fabrics that could withstand the rigors of daily labor while also providing a degree of insulation. Wool was the most common material, as it was relatively accessible, durable, and, most importantly, excellent at retaining warmth even when damp. Sheep were a vital asset for rural families, and every part of the animal was utilized. The wool was sheared, washed, carded, spun into yarn, and woven into thick, coarse fabric. A single woolen garment could take weeks or even months to produce, making it a valuable possession. Most peasants owned only a few articles of clothing, perhaps a tunic, a pair of breeches, and a cloak or mantle, so layering was essential to maintain warmth. The tunic was the foundational garment, a simple, loose-fitting piece that fell to the knees or ankles. Made from undyed wool, it was usually dark, earthy in color, and scratchy against the skin. Beneath the tunic, some peasants wore a linen undershirt, though linen was a more expensive fabric and not as commonly owned by the poorest families. Breeches or trousers were equally utilitarian. They were typically made of the same heavy wool, belted at the waist with a length of cord or leather. During the coldest months, some peasants layered multiple pairs of breeches, stuffing them with straw or scraps of cloth to create extra insulation. Though cumbersome and bulky, this practice provided much-needed warmth against the biting wind. Footwear was another critical component of winter clothing. Shoes were often little more than rough, poorly constructed leather pieces, bound together with twine or strips of fabric. These shoes offered minimal protection against the cold and quickly became saturated with mud, snow, and slush. To counteract this, peasants stuffed their shoes with straw, moss, or even small animal skins to provide a rudimentary layer of insulation. Socks, if they existed at all, were made from thick, hand-knitted wool and layered for extra warmth. But the most essential garment of all was the cloak or mantle. This heavy, voluminous outer garment was draped over the shoulders, secured with a simple clasp or a knotted cord, and served as a blanket as much as a coat. Cloaks were often lined with additional wool or fur, if available, to trap as much body heat as possible. Some were even constructed with hoods, providing essential coverage for the head, neck, and shoulders. The hood, in particular, was a lifeline in frigid weather, as it prevented significant heat loss through the scalp. Peasants also improvised with materials they could scavenge or trade for. Rabbit furs, for instance, were relatively easy to acquire through trapping or barter. These small pelts were sewn together to create makeshift gloves, scarves, or caps. Though less durable than leather or wool, rabbit fur was soft and warm, a rare comfort in a harsh world. For those who lived near forests or marshlands, reed and straw were also utilized as insulation. Peasants would weave reed mats or stuff straw into the lining of their clothing to create a buffer against the cold. While not particularly effective in wet conditions, these natural materials were readily available and served as an additional barrier against the elements. Another critical aspect of clothing was its ability to protect against moisture. In the medieval period, staying dry was as vital as staying warm. Wet clothing not only became heavier and more cumbersome, but it also sapped the body of heat, increasing the risk of hypothermia. To combat this, some peasants coated their cloaks and footwear with animal fat or beeswax to create a rudimentary waterproofing layer. This practice was far from perfect, but it provided a degree of protection against rain, sleet, and snow. At night, the same garments worn during the day often doubled as bedding. Cloaks were spread over straw mattresses or wrapped tightly around the body, and woolen tunics were kept on, sometimes layered with additional cloths or furs. The idea of separate sleepwear didn't exist for most peasants. Instead, they wore their day clothes to bed, hoping that the residual body heat trapped within the layers would carry them through the night. Despite all these efforts, medieval clothing was still limited in its effectiveness against extreme cold. Frostbite was a common affliction, particularly for those who spent hours working outdoors in the fields or tending to animals. Fingers, toes, and ears were especially susceptible to freezing, and without proper treatment, frostbite could lead to permanent damage or even the loss of limbs. But for medieval peasants, suffering through the cold was not just about physical discomfort. It was a reminder of their vulnerability. Each threadbare cloak, each pair of patched breeches, each straw-stuffed shoe was a testament to the relentless struggle to survive in a world where warmth was a precious, fleeting commodity. Clothing, in all its rough, heavy, and often uncomfortable form, was not just a means of protection, but a lifeline, a barrier between life and death in the unforgiving cold of the medieval winter. While medieval peasants relied on fire, clothing, and simple shelters to fend off the cold, they also developed a range of inventive, yet humble sleeping arrangements designed to conserve as much body heat as possible during the bitter winter months. In the peasant's cottage, the primary sleeping area was often a single communal space, typically located near the hearth. The hearth was the warmest part of the home, and every inch of its limited warmth was precious. At night, the fire would be banked with ashes to keep it smouldering until morning, emitting just enough heat to stave off the worst of the chill. But as the hours wore on, the fire's glow would fade, and the temperature inside the cottage would plummet. To counteract this, peasants resorted to sleeping in tightly packed groups. Family members, regardless of age or gender, huddled together on the same straw mattress, pressing their bodies close to share warmth. The physical closeness was not just practical, it was necessary. The body heat of multiple people created a shared warmth that could mean the difference between a fitful, freezing sleep and a relatively comfortable rest. Straw mattresses were the most common bedding for peasants, but these were a far cry from the soft, padded mattresses we think of today. A straw mattress was essentially a large sack or cloth bag stuffed with dried straw, hay, or rushes. Over time, the straw would become compacted, flattening out and losing its insulating properties. To keep the mattress functional, peasants would periodically restuff it with fresh straw, a labor-intensive but essential task. For additional insulation, peasants sometimes lined their sleeping area with animal skins or coarse woolen blankets. Furs from rabbits, sheep, or even dogs could be sewn together to form a rudimentary coverlet. These furs were not luxuries, but essential tools for keeping warm, especially for those without access to ample firewood. The skins retained heat well, but they also harbored fleas, lice, and other pests, making sleep not only uncomfortable, but potentially disease-ridden. In some regions, particularly in colder climates, peasants constructed sleeping platforms that were elevated off the ground. These platforms, often no more than simple wooden planks supported by stones or logs, served to keep the sleeper away from the cold, damp earth. Sleeping on the ground was a recipe for chills and illnesses, as the ground sucked heat from the body and exposed the sleeper to drafts. By raising the bed off the floor, peasants could insulate themselves more effectively and reduce the risk of waking up with aching, frozen limbs. For the poorest families, who could not afford even the most basic bedding, sleep was a far more precarious affair. They might lay directly on the ground, using only a thin layer of straw or rushes as a buffer against the cold earth. In some cases, they would huddle together under a single cloak, using their bodies and the meager straw bed as their only source of warmth. For families with animals, the barn or byre often became a secondary sleeping area. Though it might seem unpleasant, sleeping near the livestock offered distinct advantages. Animals generate considerable body heat, and their presence in the enclosed space help maintain a slightly warmer ambient temperature. Cows, goats, sheep, and even pigs could be a source of both warmth and companionship during the long, dark nights. In some cases, peasants would sleep directly above or beside the animal pens, separated by a wooden partition, or simply lying next to the animals on the hay-strewn floor. In regions prone to extreme cold, some cottages were constructed with sleeping lofts, small elevated areas near the roofline, where heat from the hearth would naturally rise and collect. The loft, accessed by a simple ladder or a series of stacked crates, provided a slightly warmer sleeping area than the main floor. While the air near the ceiling could be stuffy and smoky, it was also warmer, making it a desirable sleeping space during the harshest winter nights. Peasants also devised makeshift canopies or bed curtains, crafted from scraps of fabric or old cloaks. These drapes hung around the sleeping area, trapping body heat and blocking drafts. Though they offered minimal insulation, they provided a psychological sense of security and a small, enclosed space where the warmth of one's breath and body could accumulate more effectively. For infants and small children, special care was taken to keep them warm. Babies were often wrapped in layers of cloth or placed in wooden cradles lined with straw and fur. In the absence of proper cradles, some parents used wooden troughs or baskets, placing them near the hearth to ensure the baby stayed warm. Mothers would also sleep with their infants, holding them close against their bodies to provide shared warmth and prevent them from freezing in the night. Despite these efforts, many peasants still suffered from the cold, and sleep was often fitful and uncomfortable. Nighttime was a vulnerable time, a period when the darkness and cold combined to remind peasants of the fragility of life. A particularly harsh winter could lead to widespread sickness, frostbite, and even death, particularly among the young, the old, and the weak. Sleep, then, was not just a period of rest, but a nightly struggle for survival. Every night, peasants wrapped themselves in what little warmth they could muster, said a quick prayer to keep the cold and darkness at bay, and drifted off to sleep, hoping that the fire would not go out and that morning would bring a reprieve from the frigid, relentless chill. For medieval peasants, food was not just a source of nourishment, it was a vital source of warmth and comfort, especially during the bone-chilling months of winter. As the temperature dropped and the days grew shorter, the focus shifted from lighter, fresher fare to hearty, calorically dense meals designed to fortify the body against the relentless cold. But in the depths of winter, fresh ingredients were scarce. The fields lay dormant under a blanket of frost, and the markets offered little beyond what had been preserved or stored in the autumn months. Thus, the medieval peasant diet during winter was a testament to both frugality and ingenuity, relying heavily on preserved foods, root vegetables, and slow-cooked stews that could be stretched to feed a family for days. One of the most essential winter foods was pottage, a thick, hearty stew made from whatever ingredients were available. Pottage could be made with dried peas, beans, root vegetables like turnips and parsnips, and any leftover grains or barley. The mixture was simmered slowly over the hearth, allowing the flavors to meld and the ingredients to soften into a thick, warming porridge. Meat, if it was available at all, was added sparingly, perhaps a few scraps of salted pork, a bone for flavor, or a handful of dried fish. Bread, a staple of the medieval diet, was also a critical source of sustenance and warmth. Peasants typically consumed coarse, dense bread made from barley, rye, or oats, as wheat was too expensive and reserved for the upper classes. During the winter months, bread was often made from flour that had been stored since the autumn harvest, mixed with dried peas or beans to stretch the supply. The bread was baked into hard, heavy loaves that could last for weeks, providing a constant, albeit monotonous, source of calories. To make the bread more palatable, slices were often toasted over the fire or soaked in pottage to soften them. In some cases, bread was crumbled into stews to thicken the broth, creating a filling, rib-sticking meal that could keep a peasant warm for hours. For additional warmth, peasants relied on gruel, a thin, watery porridge made from oats, barley, or other grains. Though it was far from luxurious, gruel was quick to prepare and easy to digest, making it a common meal for children, the elderly, and those who were ill. To add flavor and a bit of warmth, gruel was often seasoned with dried herbs or a pinch of salt, both of which had been carefully stored and rationed since the autumn. Another essential component of the winter diet was preserved meat. In the autumn, peasants who had managed to slaughter a pig or a few chickens would go to great lengths to ensure that the meat would last through the winter. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried to prevent spoilage, then hung from the rafters of the cottage or stored in earthen jars, packed with salt or lard. Salted meat was tough and often extremely salty, so it had to be soaked in water before cooking to remove some of the brine. The meat was then simmered slowly in pottage, stew, or broth, releasing its flavor and adding a much-needed dose of protein to the otherwise sparse diet. Root vegetables, such as turnips, carrots, onions, and parsnips, were another key element of the winter diet. These hardy crops could be stored in root cellars, buried in straw, or left to overwinter in the ground, where they would remain viable for months. Once harvested, they were peeled, chopped, and added to stews, serving as both filler and a source of essential vitamins. In particularly harsh winters, peasants resorted to consuming dried legumes, peas, beans, and lentils that had been stored since the previous summer. Dried legumes were inexpensive, filling, and easy to store, making them a staple in the winter pantry. Rehydrated and simmered for hours, they could be made into thick soups or mashed into pastes, providing a dense, warming meal that required little in the way of seasoning or additional ingredients. Herbs and spices were rare and highly valued, especially in winter. While the wealthy had access to imported spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, peasants relied on whatever wild herbs they had managed to dry and store. Sage, thyme, rosemary, and garlic were among the most common, not only for their flavor, but also for their perceived medicinal properties. Garlic, in particular, was believed to ward off illness and strengthen the body against the cold, making it a staple in winter cooking. For warmth and comfort, peasants also drank ale or weak beer, both of which were safer to consume than water and provided a small amount of calories. Brewing ale was a communal activity, and every household had its own recipe, using whatever grains or herbs were available. In winter, ale was often served warm, heated over the fire, and mixed with honey, spices, or even a bit of butter to create a rich, nourishing drink that helped stave off the chill. In extreme cases, when food stores ran dangerously low, peasants were forced to resort to more desperate measures. This might include consuming acorns or other foraged nuts that had been painstakingly leached of their bitter tannins and ground into a coarse flour. In some regions, the bark of trees, particularly the inner cambium layer, was stripped and dried to create a rough, fibrous bread that was difficult to digest but provided some measure of sustenance. For those living near the coast, fish was a crucial source of protein during the winter months. Fish could be salted, dried, or smoked, preserving it for months. Inland, peasants might catch eels, frogs, or even birds, all of which were considered fair game in a season when every morsel of food counted. Despite the scarcity of food, peasants still gathered for communal meals during feast days or religious holidays. During these times, even the poorest families would attempt to scrape together a slightly more substantial meal, perhaps a meat pie made from whatever bits of meat and offal were available, or a pudding made from oats and honey. These shared meals provided not just physical sustenance, but also a brief, welcome respite from the relentless hardships of winter. In the end, the medieval peasant's winter diet was a delicate balance of preservation, rationing, and creativity. Every bite of food was a testament to months of hard work, careful planning, and the ever-present fear that the next meal might not be as substantial or as warm. And through it all, the cold remained, gnawing at the edges of every meal, every mouthful, a constant, unyielding companion throughout the long, dark nights. For medieval peasants, maintaining warmth in the home was a constant, all-consuming challenge. While the hearth served as the central source of heat and light, it was by no means sufficient to keep the entire cottage warm, especially during the dead of winter when icy winds howled through the gaps in poorly constructed walls. Thus, peasants had to find creative ways to insulate their homes, minimize drafts, and preserve what little warmth they could generate. The average peasant dwelling was a simple, one-room structure made from readily available materials: wood, wattle and daub, straw, and mud. Unlike the stone fortresses of the nobility, these cottages offered minimal protection against the elements. Walls were often thin, constructed from wooden beams interwoven with sticks or reeds, and then plastered over with a mixture of mud, clay, and straw. This rudimentary construction provided only limited insulation, allowing cold air to seep through the cracks and crevices, chilling the occupants to the bone. To combat drafts, peasants stuffed gaps and holes in the walls with whatever materials they could find: rags, straw, dried moss, or animal fur. This method, though crude, was surprisingly effective in reducing airflow and preventing icy gusts from penetrating the living space. Additionally, during the colder months, peasants might apply an extra layer of mud and straw to the exterior walls, creating a thicker barrier against the wind. Windows, if they existed at all, were small and often covered with oiled cloth, parchment, or thin animal skins rather than glass. These coverings allowed some light to enter while blocking out cold air. In some cases, wooden shutters were added, providing an extra layer of protection against winter storms. When the wind howled particularly fiercely, the shutters were secured with ropes or stones to prevent them from flying open. Despite these efforts, floors remained a major source of cold. Most peasant cottages had dirt floors, which absorbed moisture and became icy during the winter months. To insulate the ground, peasants laid down thick layers of straw, hay, or rushes, creating a rough but functional carpet that not only provided some measure of warmth, but also absorbed dirt and debris. Periodically, the straw was swept out and replaced with fresh bedding to prevent the buildup of mold, rot, and vermin. In some regions, particularly in colder climates, peasants raised their sleeping areas off the ground to avoid contact with the frigid earth. Simple wooden platforms, pallets, or raised straw beds provided a slight elevation, allowing the cold air to sink while preserving the body heat radiated during sleep. The ceiling, often low and sloping, also played a crucial role in retaining warmth. The lower the ceiling, the less space there was for heat to escape, making it easier to trap warm air from the hearth. In some cottages, wooden beams and rafters were covered with hanging fabrics, animal skins, or woven mats to create a makeshift barrier against the cold. This practice also prevented warm air from escaping through the roof, which was typically made of thatch or wooden shingles. Thatch, while not particularly durable, did provide some insulation when properly maintained. Thick, tightly packed layers of straw, reeds, or heather created a natural barrier against the elements, preventing rain, snow, and wind from penetrating the roof. However, thatch also harbored pests like mice, rats, and insects, necessitating regular maintenance and replacement. Within the cottage, furniture and personal belongings were strategically arranged to maximize warmth. Beds, for instance, were placed close to the hearth, where residual heat could provide some comfort throughout the night. Wooden chests, crates, and barrels were positioned against walls to block drafts, while blankets, cloaks, and animal skins were hung from rafters or draped over doorways to act as rudimentary curtains. Another important method of insulation involved creating partitioned spaces within the cottage. By hanging sheets, woven mats, or old cloaks around the sleeping area, peasants effectively reduced the size of the living space, concentrating the warmth generated by the fire. This technique not only conserved heat, but also provided a sense of privacy and enclosure in a communal living arrangement. Despite all these efforts, there were still nights when the cold was simply unbearable. During especially harsh winters, peasants might gather in closer quarters, clustering together for warmth. Extended families, including children and elderly relatives, would sleep side by side, using shared body heat to stave off the chill. Animals, too, were often brought inside, their presence serving as an additional source of warmth. The body heat generated by a cow, a few chickens, or a pig could make a significant difference in a small, enclosed space. In dire circumstances, peasants employed even more desperate measures to keep warm. Heated stones were placed in the hearth, then wrapped in cloth and tucked into bedding to serve as makeshift bed warmers. These stones retained heat for hours, providing a small but welcome source of warmth through the long, frigid night. In some areas, peasants created fire pits in the center of the cottage floor, where hot coals could be buried beneath a layer of ash. This technique allowed the coals to smolder slowly, emitting heat throughout the night, without the need for constant tending. However, the risk of fire was ever present, and accidents could easily result in the destruction of the entire dwelling. For many, the struggle to stay warm was a constant reminder of their vulnerability. The cold crept in through every crack and crevice, biting at exposed skin and chilling the bones. Frost formed on walls and ceilings, turning straw bedding to ice and leaving fingers and toes numb and aching. But for the medieval peasant, enduring the cold was not just a matter of survival. It was a daily test of resilience, ingenuity, and resourcefulness. Every act of insulation, every makeshift partition, every shared blanket was a small victory against the relentless cold, a testament to the peasant's determination to survive, even in the harshest and most unforgiving of winters. Despite the chill that pervaded their homes and the limited resources available to them, medieval peasants still found ways to gather together, share stories, and maintain a sense of community during the long, dark winter nights. These gatherings, often centered around the hearth, provided not only warmth, but also much-needed social connection, reinforcing bonds and lifting spirits when the cold seemed unrelenting. In the evenings, After a day of grueling labor in the fields or tending to livestock, the family would gather in the main room of the cottage. The hearth, with its flickering flames and modest warmth, became the focal point of the household. Here the entire family, parents, children, and sometimes even neighbors, would sit together, huddled close to absorb the precious heat emanating from the fire. Seating was sparse, consisting mainly of rough wooden stools, benches, or simply the floor, which was typically strewn with straw or rushes for added insulation. Blankets, cloaks, and animal skins were draped around shoulders and laps, as the fire's warmth was fleeting and any distance from the hearth quickly became a freezing void. The hearth was more than just a source of warmth. It was also the primary source of light. With no glass windows to let in sunlight and candles being too costly to burn frequently, the fire provided the only illumination during the long winter nights. Its flickering light cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an eerie yet mesmerizing backdrop against which stories, tales, and gossip were shared. Storytelling was a crucial aspect of these nightly gatherings. In a world where most peasants were illiterate and books were rare and expensive, oral tradition was the primary means of entertainment and education. Parents and elders recounted folk tales, legends, and family histories, their voices rising and falling in rhythm with the crackling of the fire. Some stories were cautionary tales, meant to instruct the younger members of the household in matters of morality, survival, or religious faith. These stories often featured supernatural elements, ghosts, spirits, and dark creatures that prowled the night, waiting to prey upon the careless or unwary. Such tales served not only to entertain, but also to instill a sense of caution and vigilance, reminding listeners of the dangers lurking beyond the cottage walls. Other stories were humorous or heartwarming, offering a brief reprieve from the cold and the hardships of daily life. These tales often revolved around clever peasants who outwitted wealthy landowners, mischievous animals who played tricks on each other, or humble heroes who triumphed against seemingly insurmountable odds. For a few moments, the cottage was filled with the sound of laughter, a rare and precious commodity during the bleak winter months. Music, too, played a vital role in these gatherings. Instruments were rare, but some peasants owned simple flutes, pipes, or drums crafted from animal hides. More often, singing took precedence, as it required no tools and brought the family together in a shared act of expression. Songs ranged from folk ballads and seasonal hymns to work chants and lullabies, each carrying with it the echoes of generations past. Even in the absence of instruments, the rhythmic tapping of wooden spoons or the clapping of hands kept time as family members sang, the repetitive melodies weaving through the air like a spell, warding off the darkness outside. The hearthside also provided a rare opportunity for practical activities that required both light and warmth. Women and older children would use the time to mend clothing, patch holes in blankets, or weave new garments from homespun wool. The wool, freshly shorn from the family's sheep, was first carded to remove tangles, then spun into yarn using a simple spindle or spinning wheel. The rhythmic whir of the spindle, the click of wooden needles, and the soft murmur of voices created a comforting backdrop to the night's work. Each stitch, each woven thread, was a small act of defiance against the winter chill. A tangible reminder that despite the cold, life went on, and preparations for the future continued. Food, though scarce, was also shared during these hearthside gatherings. Simple meals of pottage, gruel, or bread were doled out in wooden bowls, and the family ate together, savoring each mouthful as though it were a feast. On particularly cold nights, a special treat might be prepared, a small portion of dried fruits soaked in warm water, a handful of roasted chestnuts, or a spoonful of honey stirred into a pot of warm ale. Even the most meager meal, when eaten together, became a source of warmth and comfort. The act of sharing food reinforced familial bonds and reminded everyone that, despite the hardships, they were not facing the cold alone. For children, these evenings around the hearth were both a time of bonding and a vital part of their education. Elders passed down practical knowledge, teaching the young how to sew, spin, or carve simple wooden tools. They also imparted lessons about survival, how to identify edible plants, how to set a trap for small game, how to read the weather and predict storms. Religious instruction also featured prominently. The Bible or other religious texts were read aloud by those who could read, and prayers were recited as a family, seeking protection from the harsh elements and giving thanks for the fire that kept them warm. The darkness outside was equated with spiritual darkness, a force to be held at bay by faith, fire, and family unity. When the fire began to wane and the room grew colder, the family would eventually retire to their sleeping areas. Embers were banked with ash to keep them smouldering until morning, and the hearth was carefully inspected to prevent accidental fires. The cottage would be plunged into near total darkness, save for the faint glow of the dying coals, and each person would burrow beneath blankets, cloaks, and straw bedding, seeking whatever warmth remained from the fire's final, fading breath. For the poorest peasants, even these nightly gatherings were not always possible. In households where food was especially scarce or firewood had run out, the hearth would remain cold and dark, and the family would retreat to their beds early, huddling together in silence, shivering through the long hours until dawn. But for those who could afford even a modest fire, the hearthside gatherings offered a vital sense of connection, a few hours of warmth, and a brief escape from the harsh reality of life in the medieval countryside. It was a time for stories and songs, for shared meals and shared burdens, for laughter and prayer, and, above all, for holding on to the fragile, flickering flame of human warmth against the vast, indifferent cold. In the harsh, unforgiving winters of the medieval era, when darkness fell early and lingered late, the concept of sleep took on a very different rhythm from what we know today. For medieval peasants, sleep was not a single, uninterrupted stretch of rest, but rather a segmented experience, consisting of two distinct periods: first sleep and second sleep. This biphasic sleep pattern was deeply ingrained in the rhythms of daily life, dictated by both necessity and circumstance. The notion of first sleep and second sleep was not merely a peculiar custom, but a practical adaptation to the constraints of medieval life. After a long day of labor, peasants would settle down to rest shortly after sunset, when the last embers of the hearth began to fade. The first sleep typically lasted for several hours, beginning in the early evening and ending around midnight. During this initial phase, families would sleep close together for warmth, often packed tightly under shared blankets, animal skins, and layers of straw bedding. But the night was far from over when the first sleep ended. Around midnight, or slightly after, many peasants would awaken naturally, as though their bodies were attuned to this pattern of segmented sleep. This waking period, known as the watch, could last anywhere from 1 to 2 hours and was considered a time for quiet, contemplative activities. The watch was a liminal period, a pocket of time that hung suspended between the world of sleep and the return to slumber. It was a time when the cottage was shrouded in darkness, save for the faint glow of embers or the weak flicker of a rushlight. The air was cold, the silence deep and pervasive, and the rest of the village lay in similar states of semi-consciousness, each household quietly passing through its own watchful hour. What did peasants do during the watch? Despite the darkness and cold, this time was surprisingly active. Some took the opportunity to tend to the fire, adding a few more sticks or embers to ensure it did not go out completely. The hearth was a precious resource, a source of life-sustaining warmth, and it required constant vigilance to keep it alive throughout the frigid night. Others used the watch for simple household tasks, particularly those that could be done quietly and without much light. Women might sit by the hearth and mend clothing, their hands working steadily in the dim light. Children might be hushed and lulled back to sleep with whispered lullabies or soft rhythmic storytelling. Men might sharpen tools, patch shoes, or repair broken wooden implements, their faces illuminated only by the faint orange glow of the coals. For some, the watch was also a time for introspection and prayer. The darkness and stillness of the night fostered a sense of intimacy with the divine, and many peasants would take this opportunity to pray, confess sins, or simply sit in silent contemplation. Those who could read, a rarity among the peasantry, might quietly recite psalms or passages from a well-worn prayer book. Even those who could not read were familiar with certain prayers and hymns, which they recited from memory, their voices rising softly in the cold air. The watch was also a time for sharing confidences. Couples might engage in quiet conversation, discussing plans for the next day, expressing worries, or simply enjoying each other's company. The intimacy of the watch allowed for private moments that were rare in the crowded, bustling atmosphere of the cottage during daylight hours. In some cases, the watch was even considered a time for marital intimacy, a brief stolen respite from the constant demands of labor and survival. In regions where superstitions and folk beliefs held sway, the watch took on a more ominous character. The hours between midnight and dawn were believed to be a time when spirits roamed freely, when the barrier between the living and the dead was at its thinnest. This was the witching hour, a period when supernatural forces were said to be at their most potent. Peasants whispered tales of spirits, demons, and restless souls, warning one another to stay indoors and avoid unnecessary movements. Some even kept protective talismans or recited charms to ward off malevolent entities. The flickering embers in the hearth were thought to keep such spirits at bay, their light serving as a beacon of human presence in the vast, cold void of the night. Eventually, as the watch drew to a close, peasants would return to bed for their second sleep. This second period of sleep was typically deeper and more restful than the first, lasting until the first light of dawn crept through the shutters, or until the crowing of a rooster signaled the start of another day of toil. When morning finally arrived, the household would stir, rubbing the last vestiges of sleep from their eyes and huddling once again around the hearth. The fire, if properly tended during the watch, would still retain a few embers, ready to be stoked back to life. Bread would be toasted, pottage reheated, and the day's labours would begin anew. Interestingly, the practice of segmented sleep persisted for centuries, not just among peasants, but across all classes. It was only with the advent of artificial lighting, the Industrial Revolution, and the push toward more structured work hours that the pattern of first and second sleep began to fade. As people began to stay up later and compress their sleep into a single, continuous block, the watch gradually disappeared, relegated to the pages of history. But in the depths of the medieval winter, when nights stretched endlessly and the cold gnawed at bones and spirits alike, the watch remained a vital, if eerie, interlude, a time when the world fell silent, the flames grew dim, and the line between sleep and wakefulness blurred into a space where dreams and reality mingled like smoke drifting through the darkened room. As the cold, relentless winter gripped the medieval countryside, the importance of community and shared resources became absolutely vital for survival. Peasants rarely faced the bitter nights alone. Instead, they relied heavily on their neighbors and the extended village network to weather the harsh conditions. The collective strength of the community was a lifeline against the biting cold, scarce food, and endless labor demands. Village life was centered around mutual aid and cooperation. The peasants understood that individual survival was closely tied to the well-being of the group. When winter set in, tasks that might have seemed manageable alone suddenly became overwhelming, and so neighbors pitched in to help one another in countless ways. This spirit of interdependence extended from sharing food and firewood to pooling labor for repairing homes or tending animals during freezing weather. One of the most critical resources was firewood, which was labor-intensive to gather and indispensable for warmth and cooking. The villagers often coordinated collective trips to nearby woodlands to fell trees, split logs, and haul bundles back to their cottages. These trips were not just physical labor, but also social events, occasions for storytelling, singing, and maintaining social bonds. The wood was then carefully rationed and stored in communal stacks or individual sheds, with an understanding that waste could be deadly during the coldest months. Another crucial form of mutual support involved food sharing. Winter was the season of scarcity, when fresh crops were long gone and food stores had to be stretched to their limits. Peasants often pooled their remaining provisions, especially staples like grains, salted meat, or preserved vegetables, to ensure that no one family went completely hungry. Shared meals or the exchange of surplus goods created a safety net, softening the harsh edges of deprivation. In addition to material aid, the village offered social and emotional support. Winter was a time when isolation and despair could easily take hold, with short daylight hours and bitter weather keeping people confined indoors. The community gathered whenever possible, around hearth fires, in church services, or during seasonal festivals, to reinforce bonds and lift spirits. These moments were essential for mental health, providing breaks from relentless hardship and reminders that they were not alone in their struggles. Craftsmen and specialists within the village played key roles during winter. Blacksmiths, for example, might work through the cold months to repair tools and horseshoes, enabling peasants to continue farming and transporting goods despite the weather. Women skilled in weaving and spinning produced warm clothing and blankets, often in communal settings where conversation and shared work eased the long hours indoors. Furthermore, the village elders and religious leaders often acted as guides and comforters. Their knowledge of traditional remedies, spiritual counsel, and folklore helped villagers cope with illness, loss, and fear. The local priests' sermons and prayers were sources of hope, while midwives and healers attended to the sick and elderly, their work indispensable during a time when professional medical care was all but non-existent. In some communities, village commons or shared lands were vital during winter. Peasants could graze their animals on common pastures, gather firewood, or collect wild herbs and berries as supplementary food. This access to communal resources reduced the risk of total deprivation and underscored the importance of collective ownership and responsibility. Despite these communal bonds, tensions could sometimes flare. Scarcity bred competition, and harsh winters tested the limits of goodwill. Disputes over resource allocation, debts, or labor obligations occasionally erupted, threatening the fragile equilibrium. However, village customs, local courts, and long-standing social norms usually mediated conflicts, preserving unity in the face of adversity. Overall, the medieval peasants' winter experience was deeply social, embedded in a web of relationships and shared practices that transformed the bleak, freezing nights into a collective ordeal. This mutual reliance was not just a strategy for survival, it was a defining feature of medieval rural life. weaving individuals into a resilient fabric that could endure the coldest nights and hardest times. One of the most challenging aspects of surviving the coldest medieval nights was dealing with the limited and often poor quality of medieval clothing. Unlike today, where insulated fabrics and layered gear are commonplace, peasants had to make do with what natural materials they could gather, spin, and sew themselves, often with limited resources. Clothing was not just a matter of fashion, but a crucial defense against the biting cold that could lead to illness or even death. Most medieval peasants wore several layers to trap warmth, starting with a simple linen shirt or chemise worn next to the skin. Linen was prized because it was breathable and relatively soft, but did little to insulate. Over this base layer, they would add woolen garments, perhaps a tunic or dress made from coarse wool, which was the most common material available. Wool was highly valued for its insulating properties. It could keep warmth close even when damp, a vital feature during the wet and snowy winter months. Outer garments like cloaks and hoods were often lined with additional layers of wool or fur, if a family was fortunate enough to have access to animal pelts. These cloaks could be wrapped tightly around the body, shielding peasants from harsh winds and snow. Fur was rare and precious. It was typically reserved for those slightly better off, or saved for the coldest parts of winter. Footwear was another critical concern. Most peasants wore simple leather shoes or boots, often handmade, that protected their feet from the cold and rough terrain. But because shoes were expensive and prone to wear, many peasants patched their footwear repeatedly or resorted to going barefoot indoors to preserve their shoes' lifespan. Woolen or linen socks might be knitted or woven, but these were precious and not always available in sufficient quantities. Medieval peasants also used accessories strategically for warmth. Woolen caps or hoods covered the head, a key point of heat loss. Gloves or mittens made of leather or wool protected hands, and scarves or shawls were wrapped around the neck and shoulders. Since heat escapes quickly from exposed skin, these small coverings made a significant difference in comfort and survival. Clothing was carefully maintained and repaired. Rips and tears were sewn promptly because replacing garments was costly and time-consuming. Many peasants learned to spin, weave, and sew from a young age, skills essential not only for creating new clothing, but also for patching and repurposing old garments. Winter clothing was not only practical, but also deeply intertwined with social status. Wealthier villagers or minor landowners might have access to dyed fabrics, finer weaves, and better quality furs, whereas peasants typically wore undyed, coarse wool. However, even the poorest peasants were resourceful in layering their garments to maximize warmth and protection. When the temperature dropped severely, peasants huddled closely inside their homes, layering clothes and blankets for extra insulation. Sharing warmth was not just about physical proximity, but also a practical way to conserve heat in small, poorly insulated dwellings. Thus, medieval clothing during winter was a combination of necessity, ingenuity, and resourcefulness, designed to withstand the brutal cold with minimal resources. While simple by today's standards, these garments were lifelines in the fight against winter's relentless chill. The bitter cold of medieval winters was often accompanied by a harsh and unforgiving landscape that added another layer of difficulty to peasant survival. Thick snowdrifts, frozen rivers, and icy roads isolated villages, making travel dangerous and sometimes impossible. This geographical challenge meant that peasants had to prepare extensively before winter fully set in, anticipating the long months of confinement and scarcity ahead. Villages were typically located near rivers or streams, essential for water and irrigation during the warmer seasons. But in winter, these waterways often froze, cutting off easy access to fresh water. Peasants had to rely on wells, which could be difficult to dig deep enough or keep from freezing. In some cases, they melted snow for water, though this was laborious and time-consuming. The scarcity of fresh water was a constant worry, especially when illness struck and hydration became crucial. Snow and ice also made farming impossible during winter, forcing peasants to cease outdoor work and focus on indoor tasks and preservation efforts. This seasonal shutdown affected not only food production, but also income and trade. Many peasants depended on the surplus they had stored during the harvest and the communal support of their village to get through these months. Travel was another major challenge. Roads were little more than dirt paths and often became impassable during heavy snow or ice storms. This isolation meant that villages had to be self-sufficient during winter. External trade or visiting markets was often out of the question, cutting off access to goods that weren't produced locally. In some cases, isolated communities developed unique traditions and survival strategies tailored to their specific geography and climate. In extreme cases, the winter isolation could last for weeks or months. This confinement fostered a strong reliance on family and village networks for both physical and emotional support. It also encouraged the development of winter pastimes and rituals, including storytelling, music, and religious observances, which helped to maintain morale in the face of adversity. Winter also posed significant risks for animals that peasants depended on for food, labor, and clothing. Livestock had to be sheltered, fed stored hay or grain, and protected from the freezing cold. Loss of animals during winter could be devastating, threatening the village's ability to survive until spring. This added pressure meant that peasants often spent considerable time before winter building barns, securing feed, and tending to their animals' needs during the cold months. In summary, the medieval winter landscape was both a physical barrier and a relentless adversary. Its frozen rivers, snow-bound paths, and biting winds shaped every aspect of peasant life during the coldest nights, demanding careful preparation, community resilience, and unwavering endurance. As the cold nights deepened and food supplies dwindled, medieval peasants often turned to their ingenuity and traditional knowledge to stretch their provisions and keep hunger at bay. The art of food preservation was an essential survival skill during the winter months, when fresh produce was unavailable and hunting was nearly impossible due to weather conditions. One of the most common preservation methods was salting. Salt was a precious commodity, sometimes imported from coastal regions or mined in inland salt works, and it was used to cure meat and fish. Peasants would rub salt into cuts of pork, beef, or fish to draw out moisture and inhibit bacterial growth, allowing the meat to be stored for months. Salted meat, though tough and salty, was a critical source of protein during the coldest times. Another widespread technique was smoking. Meat or fish was hung over low fires or in smokehouses to dry and infuse the food with preservative compounds. This method not only preserved food, but also added flavor and could be combined with salting for extended longevity. Smoking was labor-intensive and required skill to maintain the right balance of heat and smoke, but it was indispensable for winter survival. Drying was also used for fruits, herbs, and some vegetables. Berries, apples, and herbs were sliced and hung in warm, dry places, inside homes or barns to slowly lose moisture. Once dried, these foods could be stored for long periods and rehydrated when needed for cooking or medicinal use. In addition to these methods, peasants relied heavily on root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and parsnips, which could be stored in cool, dark cellars or pits for months without spoiling. These hardy crops were staples during winter, often boiled or mashed to provide much-needed calories and nutrients. Peasants also made use of fermentation. Sauerkraut, a fermented cabbage dish, was one example of how fermentation preserved vegetables while adding beneficial nutrients. This method was common in parts of Europe and helped provide essential vitamins when fresh produce was scarce. Honey and vinegar played roles in food preservation and preparation, acting as natural antiseptics and flavor enhancers. Honey was valuable not only for its sweetness, but also for its ability to prevent spoilage in some foods. All these techniques required careful planning during the harvest season, as peasants had to anticipate the coming winter and prepare adequate stores. Preservation was a communal effort as well, with knowledge shared among villagers and often passed down through generations. Preserved foods were typically cooked slowly to soften tough, salted or dried meats, often combined with grains like barley or oats to make hearty stews and porridges. These dishes were the main sustenance during long winter evenings, providing energy and warmth. Through these resourceful methods, medieval peasants transformed the limitations imposed by winter into manageable challenges, relying on time-tested preservation skills that kept their families fed through the coldest and darkest months.